Before the day begins its slow unfurling, before colors return to the world, there is a moment when the sky seems to balance on the edge of awareness. It is a moment that doesn't so much arrive as it gently collects itself above the horizon, quiet as a held breath. And in that moment, when even the birds hesitate to speak, Venus appears. Not with fanfare, not with urgency, but with a patient certainty, as though it had been waiting all night for someone to finally look up. Before we drift toward the quiet mysteries of Venus, take a gentle moment to like and subscribe to the Late Night Scientist channel, and tell me in the comments when and where you're listening, so this peaceful science can reach more sleepy minds, easing into rest. At first, it seems almost too bright to belong to the stillness that surrounds it. The landscape below is dim, the trees darkened into silhouettes, the air cool and undecided. Yet there it is, one steady point that does not flicker the way distant stars do. It simply shines, calmly, like the last lamp left on in a sleeping house. Many people, even now, feel as though Venus is not a distant world, but a presence, a companion of early mornings and slow evenings, an old friend seen most clearly at the borders of the day. As the horizon begins to brighten, Venus holds its position with an unhurried confidence. It does not rush to disappear, nor does it struggle for attention. Instead, it lingers at the edge of light in a way that feels quietly deliberate, the way a person might pause in a doorway before stepping out. In that suspended moment, it seems less like a celestial body and more like a gentle reminder that the day hasn't quite begun, that there is still time, however brief, to remain in the softness of almost morning. There is something soothing in the way Venus glows without demanding anything from the viewer. It doesn't flash or flare or change color. It simply stays. Long ago, people noticed this calm persistence. They watched it rise and set, not in the frenzy of stars wheeling across the night, but in the slower rhythm of twilight. To them, it must have felt as though Venus was not moving through the sky at all, but rather watching the earth turn beneath it. A steadfast sentinel, or perhaps a particularly polite guest, one who always arrives early but never overstays. For those awake at that hour, bakers kneading dough under dim lights, travelers beginning their journey, night shift workers heading home, Venus often feels like a small reassurance. Not a sign or a message, just a quiet constant. Something that tells them the sky has its own way of waking up, and they are simply sharing in that gradual unfolding. A few minutes pass, the colors of dawn spreading outward from the horizon, and still Venus remains, unwilling to hurry away. It is a celestial being with no taste for the dramatic exit. The stillness around it deepens this impression. Dawn can sometimes feel like a landscape caught between breaths. The wind is often hesitant, the air neither warm nor cold, suspended in a delicate uncertainty. Even sound moves differently, softer, as though reluctant to disturb the transition. Venus, at this hour, seems perfectly suited to that hush. Its brightness is not sharp, but eased, softened by the thin veil of the morning air. It glows with the kind of calm that suggests it has no intention of being mysterious, even if it has every right to be. For ancient watchers, this gentle presence became a familiar rhythm. Without knowing anything of its nature, they gave it the kind of attention usually reserved for something closer, something living. To them, Venus was not an object passing overhead, but a participant in their mornings and evenings, a quiet companion who always appeared in the same part of the sky, at the same tender period of the day. In a world without clocks, without electrical lights, without the firm schedules we hold today, Venus would have been a subtle but reliable measure of time, a soft glow signaling that the day was about to begin or gracefully fade. There is a special comfort in patterns that never rush. Venus's movement is too slow to notice, too gradual to distract. When you look at it, you are looking at something that offers no expectation of rapid change, and that stillness has a way of easing the mind. You can watch it for several minutes without feeling the need to anticipate anything. It won't surprise you. It won't vanish, leap, or transform. It will simply be what it is. A small, steady light, high above the shifting colors of dawn. As the sun rises, the sky brightens in layers, gray to blue, blue to gold, each shade slipping quietly into the next. And there comes a point, gentle and unannounced, when Venus begins to fade from view, not because it decides to leave, but because the growing light gradually washes over it. Even then, it does not vanish abruptly. It eases into invisibility, the way a whisper blends into background noise. If you follow its place in the sky, you might feel that it hasn't disappeared at all, only softened itself into the daylight. In the evening, the experience is reversed. The day dims, colors fall away, and Venus returns, unhurried, punctual in its own timeless way. It glows differently then, against the deeper blue of twilight. But the feeling is the same. A quiet presence offering a pause before night settles in. Some people think of Venus as the planet that introduces the dawn and escorts out the daylight, a celestial usher with impeccable manners. And perhaps that is why its appearance feels comforting. It is a reminder that even in the vastness of the sky, some lights keep a gentle schedule. Some things appear not with urgency, but with grace. Venus does not hurry the morning, nor does it resist the coming night. It simply marks the edges where light and dark trade places, offering a steady shimmer to anyone awake enough or fortunate enough to notice. In that way, Venus becomes part of our own rhythm, a soft invitation to slow down, breathe, and observe the world in its quietest moments. A planet, yes, but at first light, it is mostly a feeling. A calm brightness poised between sleep and waking, between knowing and simply being. And as the day finally takes hold, Venus steps aside, leaving the sky to its sunlit duties until the next quiet horizon awaits. There is something almost endearing about the way ancient civilizations named the lights of the sky. They didn't peer through telescopes or chart data across centuries. They simply looked upward, felt something, and gave that feeling a name. Venus, with its steady radiance and gentle glow, was one of the first celestial objects to inspire this instinct. Long before it was understood as a world in its own right, it was recognized as something special, a point of light that moved through the twilight hours with unusual grace. It didn't dart or flicker like the stars. It advanced with a softness that made people pause, not to analyze but to admire. To early observers, this calm brilliance felt like the essence of beauty itself. The ancient Greeks, noticing its comforting glow just before sunrise or just after sunset, associated it with Aphrodite, the goddess who embodied allure and charm. Later, the Romans, who enjoyed adapting Greek ideas with a sense of confident practicality, renamed her Venus. They seemed certain, quite certain, that this was the proper title for the sky's most luminous wanderer. It never occurred to them that one day people might look back and say, with a gentle smile, that was quite an optimistic choice. For those early civilizations, beauty was not simply an aesthetic concept. It suggested harmony, balance, a sense of things moving in pleasing accordance. Venus, drifting through the dim hours with its serene light, felt like a celestial reassurance, a sign that the universe, in its vastness, still had room for elegance. People didn't question what lay behind that brightness. They didn't wonder about surfaces or atmospheres or temperatures. They simply saw a glow that felt peaceful, and they named it for beauty because that was the sensation it awakened. Across ancient cultures, Venus accumulated stories that reflected this impression. The Babylonians knew it as Ishtar, a symbol of love and renewal. The Maya charted its appearances meticulously, weaving it into cycles of meaning and cosmic order. In each tradition, Venus took on attributes that matched its presence in the sky, a presence that felt dependable yet slightly mysterious, bright yet calming. To human eyes, it resembled a polished jewel set carefully in the firmament, one that never shifted its shine to compete with the sun or moon. It held its place the way a modest decoration might catch the light without demanding attention. As centuries passed, the name persisted. Even when astronomy grew more precise and mathematical, when measurements replaced myth and instruments replaced intuition, the planet kept its association with beauty. Scholars mapped its path with increasing accuracy, yet none suggested calling it anything else. Once humanity bestows a flattering name, it tends to keep it, even if, in retrospect, the name may oversell certain qualities. Venus remains a timeless example of this. We named it with confidence, affection, and a generous assumption that the universe surely aligned with our poetic instincts. There is a soft humor in that assumption. One can imagine the ancient sky watchers unknowingly attaching the name of a goddess to a world they would never visit. They saw only the gentle gleam, unaware of anything beneath that brightness. Their naming could be compared to complimenting a stranger's silhouette in the distance and deciding firmly that this person must have an excellent personality. It was an endearing confidence, one rooted not in ignorance but in a willingness to trust beauty wherever it appeared. But even then, the name had layers of meaning beyond simple admiration. Venus was a guidepost in human life. It signaled the beginnings and endings of each day. the quiet hours when people rose for work or rested from it. There is something profoundly human about associating such routines with a deity of grace and affection. When people saw Venus glowing above the horizon, it might have reminded them, consciously or not, of continuity, of the rhythms that threaded through their lives. Beauty, in this sense, was not merely visual but emotional, a sense that the world could be gently predictable. Sailors grew accustomed to Venus appearing in the morning sky as they prepared their ships. Shepherds saw it descend in the evening when their flocks quieted. Farmers took note of its presence before their fields were lit by the returning sun. Across vast distances, different cultures felt a similar calm in its glow. Even without shared languages or beliefs, they responded to the same light with a comparable sense of familiarity. It is likely one of the earliest shared human experiences, looking up, noticing Venus, and feeling something soft settle within. The beauty associated with Venus was also tied to its apparent consistency. Other celestial objects behaved in ways that felt unpredictable or dramatic. Comets streaked across the heavens, meteors flared and vanished, and some stars brightened or dimmed in ways that confused even the experienced skywatchers. Venus, however, ambled along its path with the unhurried demeanor of someone who knows they will arrive precisely when they mean to. There was elegance in that confidence. A slow, steady glow seemed the perfect emblem of divine beauty. Not ostentatious, not showy, simply present. And so, without hesitation, humanity crowned this light with a name that whispered of charm: Venus. A title that passed from civilization to civilization, through languages and epochs, unchanged in its suggestion of grace. People accepted it easily, perhaps because the sky itself appeared to endorse the choice. After all, if a planet shines that brightly, that consistently, and that serenely, what else could you possibly call it? Only later, much later, did we learn that the planet beneath that glow might not entirely match the softness of its namesake. But that is another story, one best left for another chapter. For now, Venus remains what it has always been in the human imagination: a distant light touched by poetry, named with affection, and remembered for its quiet beauty long before anyone knew the truth hidden beneath its gentle shine. Imagine descending through a sky that has forgotten how to end, a sky that is not a dome or a ceiling, but a vast layered shroud, wrapped tightly enough that the idea of above dissolves into something uncertain. As you enter Venus's cloud cover, the transition is not sharp. There is no clear threshold where you pass from clarity into fog. Instead, the world thickens around you, as though the air has grown reluctant to let light travel freely. It isn't darkness exactly, just a soft dimming, a steady filtering that turns brightness into something muted, distant, and indistinct. The clouds here do not behave like those on Earth, where individual shapes drift lazily across open sky. On Venus, the cloud layers are so dense and continuous that they resemble an ocean suspended overhead. You don't see cumulus towers or drifting wisps. You see gradients, shifts in brightness so gradual they almost escape notice. The light that reaches you feels as though it has traveled a long, winding path, losing sharpness and intention along the way. It falls gently, but without direction, wrapping everything in a diffuse glow that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As you move deeper, the sense of altitude becomes strangely ambiguous. Without a visible horizon, without even distant shadows to define perspective, the mind loses its usual cues. You could be miles above the surface or moments from touching it, and nothing in the sky would confirm which is true. The clouds hold their secrets with a kind of polite firmness. They are not threatening, but they are absolute. In this place, vision reaches only as far as the atmosphere allows, which is rarely far at all. If you imagine standing on the surface, though standing is a generous word for the experience, it would feel as though the sky has drawn itself close around you. Not like a roof and not like a ceiling, but like thick fabric pulled overhead. The world would appear sealed, unfinished, perpetually waiting for the clouds to part, even though they never will. There would be no stars, no sun, no moon, not even the faintest suggestion of something beyond the pearly thickness above. It is a sky that does not open and does not intend to. The light that filters down has a strange softness to it. It resembles the glow of late afternoon on Earth, when the sun has dipped behind a dense layer of overcast clouds and the landscape is lit without shadows. But on Venus, this quality is constant, unchanging, unvarying. There is no morning, no evening, no shifting of the sun's angle. Instead, the world holds a steady glow that feels both soothing and strangely isolating. It is the kind of light that encourages quiet reflection, provided one ignores how completely it has ended the idea of looking up. As you continue your descent, you might notice that the clouds do not thin in the way you expect. On Earth, moving through fog or heavy clouds often brings you into clearer air eventually. But Venus offers no such relief. Its cloud cover stretches for incredible depths, layer upon layer, each one adding a subtle variation in tone and density. Some layers glow faintly, others dim, but none offer a break. It is like walking through a library where every wall is padded with soft, featureless material, certainly peaceful, but with a lingering sense that something essential is missing. The atmosphere dampens sound as effectively as it dims light. If you were to speak, your voice would seem smaller, less certain, swallowed almost immediately by the thickness around you. Even large movements would produce muted noise, stripped of sharp edges. This airy silence creates a sense of being suspended, as though the world has asked you to lower your volume out of courtesy. The environment feels calm, but also carefully enclosed, as though it prefers quiet company. Some explorers have described their imagined descent through Venus's sky as passing through layers of warm mist, but not mist you can touch. Mist implies droplets, refreshment, a kind of closeness to water. The clouds here feel different, more distant, more abstract. You sense them without truly feeling them, like the way fog in a dream seems to envelop you without ever brushing your skin. They change the world around you in a way that is noticeable and yet oddly intangible. The result is an experience of immersion without direct contact. If one were to imagine living within such an atmosphere, a thought exercise best taken gently, it would mean accepting a world where the sky is never fully seen. Days would not brighten or darken. The light would not shift to mark hours. Instead, existence would be defined by gradients, slightly lighter, slightly dimmer, but never sharply contrasted. It would be like inhabiting the eternal interior of a softly glowing lantern. You could walk for miles and never see the sun. You could rest for hours and never see a star. Time would become something you feel internally rather than observe externally. The sense of enclosure might even bring a curious comfort. When the world is consistently wrapped in soft, diffuse light, the mind begins to quiet. The absence of distant horizons reduces the instinct to look forward or backward. Everything feels immediate, close, and continuous. It is a landscape that asks nothing of you, offers no strong visual signals, no points of focus. You exist within it much as a small object rests at the center of a gently swirled snow globe, calm, suspended, and slightly disoriented. As you reach the lower extents of the descent, the clouds thicken further. The light grows duller, and the atmosphere presses inward with a constant, unwavering presence. It becomes clear that the sky here is not a space above the world, but a world in itself. An immense, layered realm of endless opacity. The clouds do not frame the scenery. They are the scenery. And beneath that, somewhere far below, lies the surface, a place waiting behind this enormous curtain of atmosphere. But for now, the descent remains within the sky that never parts. A sky made not of openness, but of constant softness, perpetual dimness, and the gentle reassurance of a world that long ago decided it would rather keep its secrets hidden than let its horizon show. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes from slowness, not the slowness of a drifting cloud or a quiet afternoon, but the slowness of something vast that has quietly decided it is in no hurry at all. Venus embodies this kind of slowness. It turns so gradually on its axis that a single day there becomes longer than the time it takes the planet to complete an entire trip around the sun. By earthly standards, it is a schedule that feels almost rebelliously unproductive, as though Venus looked at the cosmic calendar and simply chose the least demanding option. For most planets, rotation is a daily rhythm, a dependable beat against which everything else is set. But Venus appears to have only a faint interest in such regularity. Its rotation is so slow and deliberate that if you could sit on its surface, somehow protected from everything else happening there, you would watch the sky change position at a pace that verges on philosophical. The sun would inch across the heavens with the determination of a creature climbing a hill it never entirely wished to climb. In fact, its progress would be so gradual that you might forget it was moving at all. Days would stretch into long, languid epochs, and the very idea of morning or evening would become something closer to a polite suggestion. This extraordinary slowness gives time itself a different texture. On Earth, a day is a fast-moving thing. It begins, peaks, and fades all within the span of familiar, measurable hours. Venus, by contrast, seems to treat days like ancient storytellers treated epics, lasting so long that anyone listening is likely to fall asleep several times before the ending arrives. There is no rush to reach the conclusion. Time unfurls at a pace that feels almost ceremonial, as though each moment has been given ample breathing room. Imagine living in such an environment. Not the surface conditions, which are their own matter entirely, but simply the experience of time passing. The concept of daylight hours would not be a daily rhythm, but a rare event, slowly preparing its entrance like a guest who cannot possibly be early, because arriving late is part of the charm. If you waited long enough, the sky would brighten, but long enough would span a significant portion of a year. One might grow accustomed to thinking of daylight the way Earth-based cultures think of festivals, occasions approached with the understanding that they come when they come, not when one hopes they will. The slowness of Venus's rotation also inspires a sense of quiet amusement. The planet spins at such a leisurely pace that it resembles a dancer who insists on performing a graceful turn, but chooses to do it over several months just to savor the experience. There is no urgency, no concern about keeping time with the rest of the solar system. Venus moves according to its own understated rhythm. It is the cosmic equivalent of someone arriving fashionably late to every event, and doing so with such composure that no one dares question the choice. This deliberate pace reshapes how one imagines the flow of life there. If each day lasted longer than a year, then activities, routines, and experiences would naturally stretch outward. A simple task, such as waiting for the light to shift, would become an exercise in patience and acceptance. You could begin a project at sunrise and find yourself finishing it while the sun is still in the same place, perhaps with only a modest change in angle. The sky overhead would feel less like a clock and more like a distant, slow-turning mural. The relationship between rotation and orbit on Venus invites reflection on how deeply our own sense of time depends on celestial mechanics. Humans measure days by rotation, years by orbit, and seldom think about the connection between the two. Venus disrupts that comfortable pattern, reminding us that time is not universal. It is simply a rhythm we have chosen because it fits the world we live on. A planet where days exceed years suggests, in its quiet way, that time can be stretched like soft taffy when the cosmos feels inclined. Venus seems entirely comfortable with that idea. There is something almost meditative about a planet turning so slowly. It suggests a worldview, if planets can be said to hold such things, where haste is optional and stillness is a perfectly acceptable tempo. The solar system is filled with movement, spinning worlds, racing moons, meteors zipping through space like hurried travelers. But Venus rotates with the serenity of someone who has decided to ignore the speed of the crowd. It moves with a pace that encourages contemplation. Watching it would feel like watching a clock that ticks only a few times a year, just often enough to reassure you that it is still keeping time in its own way. Because of this slow rotation, time on Venus becomes less a cycle and more a landscape. Each moment lingers, stretches, and settles. You could wander for days, true days, measured by experience rather than celestial definition, and the sky would hardly shift. Night and day those familiar markers of earthly life, would be rare transitions rather than daily events. It is the kind of environment that blurs distinction between hours and days, between moments and seasons. Everything becomes a gentle continuum rather than a repeating pattern. In its leisurely spin, Venus quietly demonstrates that schedules are not universal, and pace is a choice written into the nature of each world. Some worlds hurry along, some worlds tumble, and Venus, in its serene manner, simply turns as though it has all the time in the universe, and perhaps believes it does. If one could step into the world beneath Venus's clouds, ignoring for a moment every sensible reason not to, the first sensation would not be a blast or a flare of heat. It would be something far quieter, an enveloping warmth that feels less like a surge and more like an atmosphere that has decided, once and for all, what temperature it prefers to maintain. The heat here is not violent. It does not lash out or pulse. It settles, it rests, it fills the environment with the calm certainty of something that has held its temperature for ages and has no plans to reconsider. There is a misconception that extreme heat must be wild, chaotic, or explosive, as though high temperatures naturally belong to scenes of molten rivers or roaring flames. Venus does not share that theatrical instinct. Instead, the warmth on its surface behaves like a permanent fixture, as steady as stone, as predictable as the horizon on a clear day. It is a place where the heat has achieved a long-term equilibrium, and in doing so has become almost contemplative. It feels less like fire and more like the deep warmth of a sun-soaked rock that never gets a chance to cool. On Earth, heat and cold trade places constantly. Even in deserts, where midday temperatures climb sharply, nights still arrive with relief, gently drawing away the day's stored warmth. Venus has no such rhythm. It does not entertain the idea of cooling, even briefly. Its surface exists in a timeless afternoon that refuses to fade. No breezes sweep in to soften it. No shadows stretch long enough to offer respite. The world simply remains in a perpetual state of settled warmth, as if the entire planet once took a long, slow breath and never exhaled. If you were able to stand on the surface, you would notice that the heat surrounds rather than scorches. The atmosphere presses inward with a kind of steady insistence, carrying warmth the way a thick blanket retains its temperature. There are no sudden changes, no gusts of cooler air hinting at variation. The environment feels unified, every inch part of the same unwavering climate. It is not a place of extremes in the sense of fluctuation. It's a place where the extreme has become gentle simply because it never shifts. This constancy creates a sense of serenity in an unusual and slightly paradoxical way. Many environments that are considered harsh are harsh because they change abruptly. Storms that rise suddenly, nights that drop in temperature, winds that shift direction without warning. Venus, however, offers no surprises. It is consistent to the point of being meditative. If planets could attend mindfulness retreats, Venus would likely teach the course on how to maintain a consistent internal temperature, regardless of external circumstances. You might even imagine the heat as a long-term resident, settled into every rock and ridge with quiet contentment. The landscape absorbs the warmth without protest, having done so for longer than one can reasonably imagine. The stones, the plains, the distant slopes, each one holds the same heat, as though they have agreed upon it collectively. There is no tension in it, no sense of conflict. Heat belongs here the way silence belongs in a deep forest, naturally, entirely, without debate. The atmosphere enhances this stability. It wraps the planet like a cocoon that refuses to let warmth wander off. Even if the surface wished to cool, it would have difficulty convincing the air above to allow it. The heat is held in place with the persistence of something that has been settling for countless millennia. If planets had preferences, Venus's choice would be clear. It has selected a temperature and intends to keep it indefinitely. In such an environment, the concept of weather takes on a different meaning. There are no gentle breezes to stir the air, no cold fronts to arrive from distant regions. The surface conditions remain so uniform that time seems to lose one of its markers. On Earth, a shift in temperature signals the passage of hours or seasons. On Venus, the warmth is so constant that it erases these divisions. Every moment feels suspended in the same slow glow. If there were inhabitants here, again, an imaginative exercise rather than a practical one, they would likely never develop words for cooler or warmer. Such terms would be unnecessary in a world that keeps its temperature with the commitment of a creature guarding an ancient ritual. One could argue with gentle humor that Venus has simply opted out the concept of evening. On Earth, evening is a time when the heat of the day retreats, leaving the world refreshed. Venus appears to have reviewed that idea and politely declined, preferring instead to maintain its warmth without interruption. It is a planet that has made its choice and sees no need to discuss it further. What emerges from this constancy is a curious sense of peace. Heat, stripped of fluctuation, becomes less of an aggressor and more of an atmosphere, an ever-present backdrop that neither rises nor falls. It is not the heat of a flame, which dances and flickers, but the heat of something that has settled into itself. A world where warmth has become a permanent companion, steady and unchanging. In this way, Venus's surface becomes a lesson in stillness. It shows that even something as powerful as heat can adopt a calm, unwavering presence when given enough time and the right environment. It becomes part of the landscape, part of the air, part of the planet's very identity. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't fade. It simply is, constant, settled, and entirely at peace with itself. Amid the many unusual qualities that make Venus feel distant and dreamlike, there is one trait that carries a quiet familiarity, one gentle tether that could make a visitor feel, for a moment, almost at home, hidden beneath the clouds, beneath the settled heat and the endless layers of atmosphere. The gravity on Venus presses downward with a strength surprisingly close to Earth's. It is not identical, but close enough that a person might take a cautious step and think, "Oh, this feels like something I know." It is a strange thought, considering everything else that defines the planet. The clouds are unbroken. The light is muted. the air thick enough to feel nearly solid. And yet, if one could stand on the surface, supported, shielded, and insulated from the environment, one's weight would feel familiar. A step wouldn't become a bound. A leap wouldn't launch you into slow motion. Your sense of balance would not need sudden recalibration. The world beneath your feet would hold you in a way that feels almost Earth-like. This similarity gives Venus a certain understated charm, the kind that only becomes noticeable when contrasted with its other, more dramatic features. In a place where the sky closes in and the light never reveals its source, the feeling of normal gravity becomes a subtle act of reassurance. You stand and you remain standing. You shift your weight, and the ground meets you with a familiarity you didn't expect. It is not generous, but it is dependable. Imagine stepping onto that surface. Again, imagining with every safety precaution humanity has yet to invent. You lower your foot carefully, half expecting to bounce or drift. Instead, you feel the firm, downward pull of gravity that respects your normal proportions. Your legs respond in the same ways they have always known. There is no sense of lightness that requires exaggerated movement. No heaviness that presses you down with alien intensity. You lift a hand, and it moves at the speed your mind anticipates. Even in a world so vastly different, your body would recognize this one familiar force. This near-familiar gravity becomes almost a gentle gesture, a small offering from an otherwise uncompromising planet. Everything else may be unwelcoming, but gravity remains polite. Not soft, not indulgent, but comforting in its predictability. It is the first thing Venus shares with Earth without any need for explanation. The comfort of this similarity becomes clearer when one considers the alternatives. On smaller worlds, such as our moon, one moves with a kind of buoyant drift, each step a careful negotiation between enthusiasm and restraint. On larger worlds, gravity becomes a firm hand, pressing movements into smaller arcs and slower lifts. Venus avoids both extremes. It holds you with just enough strength to feel steady, but not enough to feel burdened. If someone were to walk across its rocky plains, protected from the environment in ways we can only speculate about, the sensation of walking might feel like wandering through an unfamiliar but welcoming landscape. The ground might look strange, shaped by forces that Earth has never known, but the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other would feel instinctive. You could place your hand on a boulder and sense the weight behind it, and that weight would make sense. The familiarity of Venus's gravity also invites a softer kind of reflection, one about the subtle ways we are connected to our home world. Gravity is not usually something people notice. It is a quiet partner, always present, rarely acknowledged. Only when traveling to places with different gravitational strengths does the body suddenly realize how much it has relied on that constant pull. That Venus, with all its strangeness, offers a gravitational embrace so close to Earth's seems almost like a silent nod of recognition between planets. One could imagine that if a traveler found themselves drifting through Venus's strange and muted light, stepping on its surface might be the one gesture that restores a sense of grounding. literally and figuratively. The landscape may be unfamiliar, the atmosphere opaque, the sky unreachable, yet the pull beneath one's feet would feel acknowledged, almost understood. Of course, there is a gentle humor in this idea. For a world that challenges visitors in nearly every other way, Venus seems to have retained at least one Earth-like courtesy. It is a bit like entering a room where everything is disorienting except the chair in the corner, which turns out to be exactly the right height and perfectly familiar to sit in. The planet may not offer much hospitality, but the gravity at least refrains from making things more complicated. In the broader sweep of the solar system, where planets vary wildly in size, mass, and density, this gravitational similarity is a kind of quiet coincidence, a soft overlap between two very different worlds. Earth, with its oceans, its shifting weather, its living surface, and Venus, with its sealed sky and resting heat, share this one constant, the downward pull that shapes how bodies move. And there is something peaceful in that realization. It means that even in a world wrapped in dense clouds, a world with no visible sun or star, a world that holds its heat like a secret, your steps could still feel like your own. Movement, at least, would not be foreign. The ground would welcome you with familiar force, a whisper of recognition amid the vast and unyielding strangeness. In a place where almost nothing else aligns with our expectations, Venus's gravity becomes a quiet, steady reminder that familiarity can exist in the most unlikely corners of the cosmos. If you were to stand, carefully sheltered, on the surface of Venus long enough to witness the motions of its sky, you would notice something quietly astonishing. Above the muted, heavy glow of the atmosphere, the heavens move in the wrong direction, not abruptly, not in a way that demands immediate attention, but in a slow, deliberate procession that feels more like a soft reversal than a contradiction. On Venus, the sky drifts the opposite way, as though the planet has chosen to turn against the usual flow of things, not out of defiance, but because it prefers its own method. The sun, dimmed through the planet's thick atmosphere, would inch upward from the west, climbing in a direction that would feel deeply unfamiliar to anyone accustomed to Earth's ordinary rhythm. The movement would not be quick or dramatic. Instead, it would unfold with the languid patience that characterizes everything about Venus's rotation. The sun would rise as though it had all the time in the world to consider its next step, drifting unhurriedly into a sky that never truly clears. The idea of a westward sunrise has a quiet, dreamlike quality to it. It tugs gently at the expectations the mind holds without question. Most people do not think of the sky as something that can choose its direction. It is simply there, with its own patterns and habits. Venus, however, whispers softly that habits are not always universal. A sunrise can begin from the direction one normally associates with endings. Daylight can arrive from where evening should be. The sky can move backward, and life, if there were any to witness it, would adjust. To imagine the experience is to imagine a world that encourages subtle disorientation. Not the sharp kind that startles, but the gentle kind that makes one pause and tilt their head slightly. as though listening for a detail that was previously overlooked. The shifting sky on Venus would not feel chaotic. It would feel as if the world were turning an old, familiar page, but in reverse, slowly enough that you could read the words backward if you wished. The clouds above, layered in their permanent hush, would follow this motion. Their slow drift would echo the planet's backward turning, creating a landscape where everything moves in a direction that feels slightly contrary to expectation. The patterns in the sky would stretch and shift, sliding toward the east instead of the west, a reversal that might be noticed only after long contemplation. It is the kind of change that becomes apparent not through sudden change, but through the steady, quiet accumulation of detail. In this world, the sun's journey across the sky would resemble an unwinding. Instead of climbing toward the east and descending into the evening, it would begin in what earthbound minds call the wrong place, arc gently overhead, and then slip down toward the east, creating a day that feels like a story told backward. But because Venus's rotation is so leisurely, this backward story unfolds over a span so long that one could forget the direction entirely and instead marvel at the consistency of its pace. There is a certain comfort in recognizing that even celestial rules can bend. A sky that moves in reverse suggests that the universe has room for variety. Not everything turns in the same direction. Not every world follows the same choreography. Venus, with its backward sky, seems content to remind us that patterns can shift, cycles can reverse, and still, the result can be calm and orderly. Nothing frantic occurs. The retrograde motion is simply the way Venus moves, as natural to it as Earth's eastward sunrise is to us. This backward sky also invites reflection on the meaning of orientation. Humans tend to think of directions as fixed. East means rising, west means setting. But these ideas are anchored to the behavior of a single planet. On Venus, direction becomes a softer concept. East and west remain as points on a compass, but their association with beginnings and endings is gently undone. One could watch the sky's motion and realize with a certain peaceful amusement that east and west are labels that planets can reinterpret as they please. There is also, tucked within this idea, a subtle humor. Venus seems to take the concept of rotation, so straightforward on most worlds, and approach it from the opposite side, as if testing whether the cosmos would mind. And the cosmos, broad and patient, appears not to object. One can imagine Venus spinning very slowly, very gently, unconcerned with whether it's following the typical direction. It is the planetary equivalent of someone strolling down a path the wrong way, not out of rebellion, but because it happens to be a more interesting view. The sun's slow westward rise would give the sky a sense of gradual unfolding. It would be an event so extended that one might forget it is happening at all. The shift in light would be subtle, blending with the muted brightness that always filters through the air. Even the idea of tracking the sun's progress would feel less like watching a celestial marker and more like observing a gentle change in ambiance, the way one might notice a room slowly becoming warmer or cooler without pinpointing the exact moment of change. A sky like this encourages acceptance. It tells its observers, real or imagined, that direction is not as fixed as we might assume, and that the universe has space for worlds that turn backward, slowly, contentedly, with no urgency to prove anything. Venus's retrograde rotation becomes not a curiosity to puzzle over, but a soothing reminder that not everything must follow the same path. In such a sky, time moves differently, direction moves differently, and expectations soften. The sun rises from the west, journeys with languid grace, and sets in the east, offering a cosmic nod to the idea that even the heavens are capable of surprises, gentle ones, wrapped in a slow, drifting glow. If you picture the landscapes of Venus, try to imagine a world where sculpting takes place without the soft touch of water. No rivers cut delicate channels. No tides pull at shorelines. No rainfall smooths or polishes. The planet's surface has been shaped instead by slower, heavier hands, by stone that shifts under its own weight, and by heat that persuades rock to move in ways water never could. In such a place, the ground holds an ancient stillness, a quiet formed through countless ages of patient transformation. As you descend toward the surface, protected, of course, by a vessel designed for an environment that doesn't offer kindness, you would see an expanse that stretches with a quiet solemnity. Venus does not present landscapes that feel familiar in the way Earth's oceans and continents do. Instead, it lays out great plains of gently bending stone, surfaces that look as though they once softened in the heat and then settled, unmoved by wind or rain. These plains reach outward for extraordinary distances, unbroken except by the occasional rise of terrain that looks as if the planet once exhaled and pushed the ground upward in response. The absence of water means absence of the usual signs of erosion. No graceful river valleys, no patterned networks carved by streams finding their way downhill. Instead, the land shapes itself through pressure and temperature. Rocks may swell outward over long stretches of time, lifting slightly in response to forces deep beneath the crust. In places, the ground gathers itself into broad, swelling domes, as though the planet had pushed up a shoulder here or there, altering the landscape without the urgency of tectonic collisions. Travel further across these plains and the terrain shifts in character. You might come upon vast regions where volcanic activity has left its patient signature. Not the explosive, dramatic volcanoes that burst upward into jagged peaks, but wide, sprawling formations where molten rock once seeped quietly across the ground before settling again into stillness. These areas hold an almost meditative smoothness. They appear as though they were once fluid, but cooled into surfaces that remember their former movement only through subtle curves and wrinkles. Because no water flows here, the edges of these ancient lava fields remain crisp in a way Earth rarely preserves. On our planet, water would nibble away at the boundaries, softening shapes, rounding corners. Venus offers no such gentle revision. What solidifies stays solid, untouched by rains or waves. There is something strangely peaceful in that permanence. The land feels as though it has made a decision and intends to keep it. In the distance, rising out of the velvet continuity of plains, You might see highlands, regions where the crust has lifted, perhaps slowly, perhaps with the steady insistence of internal forces pushing upward. These highlands do not resemble mountains carved by glaciers or sharpened by wind. They are broader, quieter, with slopes that appear gradual from afar, but reveal great height as you draw closer. Their surfaces carry textures that tell stories not of melting ice or flowing water, but of rock being reshaped over immense expanses of time, altered by pressure alone. Standing on one of these elevated regions, you would notice a horizon that feels wider than Earth's, not because of curvature, but because the terrain is so open, so unsoftened by vegetation or atmospheric clarity. Every shape is the shape of stone. Every detail is part of a world built from foundations deeper than any ocean floor. There is a sense that the land extends as far as the imagination, then continues beyond even that. The ground beneath you might show patterns reminiscent of cracking clay, except on a colossal scale. These fractures do not hint at dryness or drought, but at the planet's internal heat, which encourages the surface to expand and contract in slow cycles. Each line and fissure is a silent record of temperature rising, cooling, rising again. On Earth, such patterns would be reshaped by wind and water. Here they remain crisp, preserved in an environment that does not erase. Wandering across these plains, though wandering suggests a level of casual freedom that Venus does not grant, one would see regions where the land seems almost quilted. Broad patches of surface sit slightly higher or lower than their surroundings, as if the crust buckled gently, then rested there ever since. These quiet deformations tell stories of deep internal movement, not the sudden movement of earthquakes, but the slow unfolding of a planet adjusting itself, making the occasional understated shift. In places where volcanic forces once pushed upward, large circular depressions may appear, vast basins that formed not from the collapse of ice or the washing away of sediment, but from the ground giving way after molten rock drained from beneath it. These depressions can stretch for miles, offering amphitheaters carved not by erosion, but by the planet's own internal breath. They lie still now, as though the world beneath them has quieted, leaving behind a structure too large and too calm to hint at the forces that made it. The absence of water brings with it a certain clarity. Each landscape feature is sharper, more deliberate. On Earth, water is a sculptor that never sleeps, always smoothing, carving, rearranging. On Venus, nothing softens the work of volcanic flows or tectonic uplift. Instead, the land remains in the shapes that fire and pressure created. Time adds weight, but not revision. It is a place where the ground holds memory without the gentle editing of weather. In this way, the surface of Venus becomes a gallery of stone shaped by a world that relies on heat rather than water to change itself. Once active plains cooled into permanence, highlands rose under the patient encouragement of internal forces. Lava fields spread quietly, then settled into place, uninterrupted by rain or wind. Everything feels both ancient and newly revealed, untouched by the constant reshaping that characterizes Earth's landscapes. To gaze across such a world is to witness a planet sculpted by endurance rather than erosion. A world where stone, warmed and pressed, performs the work usually left to oceans and rivers. And in that stillness, Venus offers a landscape that feels not barren, but enduring. A place where the land has held its shape for ages, untouched and unhurried, beneath a sky that keeps its secrets. If you look at the surface of Venus, imagining, of course, a way to peer through the endless layers of cloud, you would see a world shaped not by sudden outbursts, but by the long, steady work of volcanism. Not the familiar image of fiery mountains hurling lava skyward, but something quieter and far more patient. Venus's volcanoes have a way of existing that feels less like theatrical performance and more like a planet gently tending to its internal affairs. They shape the land not with explosive flair, but with the lawful certainty that warm rock eventually seeks an exit. Much of the planet's surface carries the imprint of these volcanic movements. You can picture broad regions where molten rock once rose from within, spreading outward across the plains in calm, glowing sheets. Instead of towering cones ready to burst at a moment's notice, these flows would have crept forward with the slow confidence of something that knows it has time, an abundance of time, to make its mark. Venus's volcanoes, at least the majority we suspect, do not seem to have been in a hurry. They shaped the land through persistence rather than spectacle. Imagine a world where eruptions occur less like the dramatic pop of fireworks and more like the gradual release of a long-held breath. The planet warms, the rock yields, and a new stretch of surface appears, smooth, dark, and still warm enough to remember its molten past. A visitor arriving long after the event might find nothing but broad fields of ancient lava, quiet now, but still bearing the calm curves of their birth. Many of these volcanic features stretch for vast distances, shaped by the easy flow of molten rock spreading across gentle slopes. Instead of rising abruptly into the sky, these formations sprawl outward, occupying space with the slow, deliberate patience of something that has no deadline. They form wide plateaus, long ridges, and smooth expanses where the terrain seems ironed flat by ancient warmth. In some places, lava once pooled and cooled into great basins with edges drawn as neatly as ink outlines. In others, the land cracked gently as it shrank, leaving patterns that resemble the surface of cooling pottery. If one were able to stand on such a plain, with all the protective equipment and improbable shielding required, you might feel as though you're walking through a place that once glowed with internal fire, but has since grown contemplative. These old volcanic regions don't look violent. They look thoughtful. Their surfaces feel as though they have spent a great deal of time cooling, settling, and accepting their final shapes. The planet has had ages to smooth its volcanic canvas, leaving behind traces that suggest activity without insisting upon it. Yet despite this pervasive calm, the story of Venus's volcanism has an undercurrent of persistence. Signs suggest that the planet has not fully retired from its internal work. There may still be warm places beneath the surface where molten rock gathers quietly, considering its options. Some areas show hints that the ground has been reshaped more recently than others, subtle cues that suggest the planet is still adjusting itself. perhaps slowly, perhaps rarely, but not entirely finished. If Venus is still volcanically active, its eruptions would likely be just as unhurried as its ancient ones. One imagines a planet that doesn't feel compelled to erupt with dramatic flourish. Instead, it might release its molten materials with the slow, steady certainty that fluids find their way into the open. The process would be less like a burst and more like a seep, a planet tidying its internal pressure the way someone might slowly loosen the lid of a jar that's been sealed too tightly, not for excitement, but for comfort. There is room here for a gentle smile. After all, even planets must occasionally let things out. Venus may not have oceans or seasons or breezes, but it does have internal heat, and heat needs an outlet. What water does for Earth, shaping, cooling, circulating, the volcanic flows do for Venus. It is a world where stone takes on the duties of renewal. Rising from within and spreading across the land with all the calm inevitability of a tide made of rock. Some volcanic structures rise like gentle mounds, broad and low against the heavier sky. Their slopes are so gradual that one might not realize they are standing on a volcano at all, but for the way the patterns of cooled lava ripple outward from the summit. These surfaces, layered by many quiet eruptions, resemble blankets folded neatly over one another, each fold representing a fresh emergence of molten rock in ages past. The planet accumulates these layers with the patience of a world that has no intention of rushing its geological cycles. Then there are the more unusual formations, vast circular depressions where the ground once bulged upward before settling again. These features speak to internal dynamics that unfold far below the surface, out of sight yet shaping everything above. They form without the need for rivers or glaciers, relying instead on the slow exchange of heat between the deep interior and the crust above. It is a process that takes place without drama, without flair, yet leaves behind structures grand enough to quiet anyone who stands before them. If one could wander across such a landscape, the impression would not be one of danger, but of great age. Every ridge, every curve in the terrain, every smooth flow field speaks of a planet that has shaped itself not with chaos, but with patience. Venus's volcanism is not retired, it is simply unhurried. It rises and settles with the same deliberate rhythm that guides the planet's slow rotation and its endless, cloud-wrapped days. And so Venus, with all its peculiar qualities, remains a place where volcanic forces operate like quiet artisans. They lay down new surfaces when needed, reshape the land with broad strokes, and then allow everything to rest. The planet may be hot, dense and sealed beneath a sky that never clears, but beneath all that, it carries the steady, persistent heartbeat of volcanic creation, a reminder that every world, in its own time, finds a way to express the heat it holds within. High above the quiet, unmoving surface of Venus, the atmosphere behaves as though it has ideas of its own, while the rocks and plains below remain committed to their ancient stillness. The clouds above engage in a ceaseless journey, circling the planet with a grace that feels both restless and peaceful at once. It is a strange harmony, an unchanging world wrapped in an atmosphere that refuses to sit still. Unlike Earth, where weather announces itself with variety, rain showers, snowflakes, shifting winds, Venus experiences something more like an eternal procession. Its clouds sweep around the planet in vast, continuous streams, moving far faster than the world beneath them turns. Yet despite their speed, the effect feels surprisingly serene, like watching a river flow while sitting on an unmoving shore. Over time, the contrast between the motion above and the stillness below becomes almost mesmerizing. There are no seasons here, no tilt of the axis to invite winter or summer, no annual rhythm to signal the changing of the year. Venus does not alter its mood in response to its position around the sun. It remains consistent, committed to its steady glow and quiet heat. The absence of seasons means the atmosphere behaves not in cycles, but in patterns. Patterns so stable and long-lasting, they seem to have settled into a kind of planetary meditation. Picture the upper clouds, thick, bright, and endlessly shifting. They streak across the sky in sweeping bands, carrying subtle differences in shade, but always maintaining their continuous motion. To someone watching, they would seem to move with purpose, though the purpose might be known only to the clouds themselves. The wind up there has no storms to break its rhythm, no sudden changes in temperature to alter its path. It simply flows, obeying a set of quiet rules born from the slow rotation of the planet and the ever-present warmth that surrounds it. If you could float within these clouds, again, imagining all the technology required to make such an experience gentle rather than overwhelming, you would feel the atmosphere embrace you with a steady, persistent push. The winds are strong, but not chaotic. They would carry you along without hesitation, as though inviting you to join the planet's endless exhale. The motion might even feel oddly soothing, like drifting in a slow-moving current that refuses to change direction. From this vantage point, the landscape far below would appear muted and indistinct, its features softened by the thick atmosphere. The surface is so calm and unchanging that it gives the impression of a world frozen in time. Meanwhile, the clouds, so full of movement, become the planet's only expression of dynamism. The world above is restless. The world below is patient. This one-sided weather system creates a feeling that Venus is holding two truths at once: motion without change, and change without motion. The clouds shift and flow, yet the surface remains steady. The winds race, yet nothing beneath them follows suit. It is as though the atmosphere and the ground have struck an agreement, one to dance, the other to watch in quiet understanding. Without seasons, weather becomes something different. On Earth, people anticipate the transitions, the warming of spring, the softening of autumn, the slow return of light in winter. Venus does not entertain these variations. Its skies do not brighten with summer or dim with winter. Instead, the light filtering through the clouds maintains a nearly constant hue, a soft, hazy glow that blurs the line between day and eternity. If you were living there, safely protected from the environment, you might lose all sense of seasonal time. There would be no cues to mark beginnings or endings. No visual signals to remind you that months have passed. Everything would simply continue. The winds, however, would always be present. Sometimes they would rush faster, wrapping themselves around the globe with impressive dedication. Other times they would slow ever so slightly, though never enough for the planet to feel still. These shifts would be subtle, too subtle for human senses to interpret as change, but they would represent the closest thing Venus has to variation. In a place without seasons, even the smallest alteration in wind speed becomes its own kind of event, though an event more felt than seen. There is a reflective calm in imagining such constancy. A world where the sky moves but does not transform, where the air whispers but never shouts. Weather without seasons is not an absence of activity. It is activity without urgency. The clouds do not hurry. They do not need to build storms or break them apart. They drift along their timeless route, their shapes morphing gently in the diffused light. One could find comfort in this predictability. The lack of sudden shifts would quiet the mind. On Venus, there would be no need to anticipate weather reports, no reason to wonder whether tomorrow will bring rain or sun. The sky will be the sky, soft, bright, and perpetually in motion. The atmosphere carries the planet's restlessness so that the surface does not have to. In this way, Venus offers a kind of meditative contrast. The winds are always moving, the ground is always still. Together, they create a world where change exists without disruption, and permanence coexists with flow. The clouds circle endlessly, like drifting thoughts that never require resolution, while the surface waits below, timeless and steady. In a universe full of planets that tilt, wobble, and cycle through seasons, Venus stands as a reminder that weather can be continuous without being varied, and that calm can exist even amid constant motion. If the surface of Venus feels like a world settled into a permanent warmth, it is because the planet has spent ages gathering heat in a slow, determined way. Not through sudden upheaval or dramatic change, but through the patient layering of warmth upon warmth, an accumulation so gradual that each step along the way must have felt natural, inevitable. The story of Venus's greenhouse effect is not the tale of a single moment. It is the tale of countless moments, each adding a small amount of heat until the planet became the place it is today. Imagine the early Venusian atmosphere, simpler, lighter, less certain of itself. Over time, the sun's rays passed through the clouds, warming the surface. The warmth rose upward again, as heat naturally does, carrying energy back toward space. But the atmosphere, thickening gradually, began to slow this escape. It held on to more of that warmth than it released. At first, this would have felt like a faint nudge, barely noticeable. A little more heat here, a little less cooling there. Nothing abrupt, nothing dramatic. But climates can change the way sand piles up on a beach, one grain at a time, until the shape becomes something new. As the atmosphere trapped more heat, the planet warmed further. That extra warmth, in turn, changed the atmosphere itself. Materials near the surface, those stored in rocks, soil, and older layers of atmosphere, began to shift state, releasing more gases upward. These gases, instead of drifting away into space, stayed close, adding to the air's ability to retain heat. Venus slowly became a place where warmth had difficulty escaping, and then more difficulty still, until eventually the heat began to build faster than it could disperse. There is something quietly fascinating in this feedback loop. It did not spiral sharply or suddenly. It unfolded with the patience of a long geological meditation. Each new layer of heat strengthened the next. The atmosphere grew dense, then denser, until it became the thick, insulating blanket that now envelops the planet. One can imagine Venus slowly settling into this state, not fighting the process, but allowing it to shape the world layer by layer. This slow accumulation created an environment where the warmth no longer rises and dissipates. It rises and stays, drifting upward only to be redirected downward again. The air acts like a series of soft curtains, catching the outgoing heat and returning it gently to the surface. Over time, this return became the planet's defining characteristic. It is a greenhouse that forgot to stop warming, a space where every attempt the planet makes to cool simply loops back into warmth once again. In a way, Venus has become a self-sustaining cycle. The heat feeds the atmosphere, and the atmosphere feeds the heat, each reinforcing the other in a long, quiet partnership. There is no single point at which one can say, here is where the change began. The transformation was gradual enough to blur such boundaries. It is the kind of process one might miss entirely if observing only short stretches of time. But over millennia, the result became unmistakable. Despite the intensity of the final outcome, there is nothing chaotic about the way Venus handles its warmth now. The heat does not pulse or spike. It does not fluctuate with seasons that do not exist. Instead, it spreads evenly across the surface, creating an environment that is surprisingly consistent. The planet holds on to its heat with steady certainty, as though it has long since accepted this role and sees no reason to alter it. Occasionally, one might imagine the air of Venus as a thick quilt wrapped around the entire world, tucking in the heat so thoroughly that no escape remains. The warmth beneath it does not rebel. It simply circulates in a slow, measured way, rising and falling, but never leaving. The result is a surface climate that feels settled, even content in its permanence. It is warm, deeply, profoundly warm, but also serene. Nothing swings wildly. Nothing cools suddenly. Everything remains wrapped in a dependable equilibrium that has taken ages to establish. There is a gentle irony here in how Venus now stands as one of the warmest places in the solar system, despite showing no visible flames, no roaring infernos. Its heat is not the heat of fire, but the heat of confinement, of energy held close and held long, a warmth that has been gathered, kept, and kept again, until the planet wears it like a second skin. In thinking about this transformation, it helps to imagine the pace of geology, which rarely rushes. Rocks melt slowly. Atmospheres thicken gradually. Climate shifts unfold across spans so large that even mountains are temporary participants. Venus's greenhouse effect is simply one such process, a world adjusting itself in slow motion, retaining sunlight the way desert stones hold onto heat long after the daylight has faded. Except here, the daylight never quite fades enough for the heat to drift away. So Venus remains in this state, a warm world not through sudden change, but through the steady, patient accumulation of heat over ages. A planet that accepted warmth and found itself unable, or perhaps unwilling, to let it go. The story is not one of catastrophe, but of endurance. A quiet, persistent rise in temperature that eventually became the very identity of the world. In this still, heavy balance of air and heat, Venus simply continues, a planet wrapped in its own collected warmth, maintaining a calm, unwavering climate, shaped not by sudden choices, but by countless small ones, each building upon the last in a long, unbroken chain. If one looks at Venus as it is now, a world wrapped in dense clouds, resting in a constant heat, shaped by stone instead of water, it can be difficult to imagine it ever being anything else. The planet feels settled in its current identity, as though it has existed in this warm stillness forever. And yet there lingers, in the quiet conversations of planetary science, a gentle suggestion that Venus may once have known a different kind of existence, a softer one, a cooler one. Perhaps even a world where water moved freely across the surface. This idea is approached carefully, like handling an old photograph whose details have faded. The evidence is subtle, scattered in patterns and hints rather than clear signatures. But the possibility remains that Venus once had water, not in steady oceans with rolling waves, perhaps, but in quantities large enough to shape the atmosphere and touch the land. If true, that would mean the planet has lived more than one life, and its current form is only the latest in a long, unfolding story. It is a quiet thought, one that invites reflection rather than certainty. Planets do not keep diaries. They do not label their epochs or preserve memories in neat stratified layers for future observers. Much of what they once were must be inferred from what they left behind, and Venus, wrapped in its thick atmosphere, hides its past with particular care. Still, some clues gently rise through the layers of cloud and heat, clues that leave room for wonder. One imagines a younger Venus, bathed in soft sunlight filtered through a thinner sky. Perhaps the surface was warm, but not overwhelming, a place where water could gather in shallow basins, or mist could cling to rock surfaces in the early light. Even a modest presence of water would have changed the planet's personality. It would have shaped its rocks differently, contributed to the air differently, and altered the balance of heat in ways that echo faintly even now. Such possibilities do not suggest Earth-like seas with shores to wander. Venus has never hinted at familiar landscapes where waves curl toward beaches or rivers trace paths through valleys. If water was present, it may have taken quieter forms, broad stretches of shallow liquid, or pools that slowly evaporated under a strengthening sun, or even long-lived vapors that hovered near the surface. The image is not dramatic. It is contemplative, like imagining a place where moisture once lingered long enough to matter. but perhaps not long enough to leave behind unmistakable marks. Yet even these quiet possibilities offer a new way to view Venus. They suggest that the planet's current warmth and stillness were shaped not only by internal processes, but by the faint memory of water that once interacted with the air and ground. The idea creates a sense of gentle continuity, a world responding gradually to what it once held and to what it slowly lost. There is also a quiet humility in this recognition that a planet can change so completely over time that its past self becomes nearly impossible to picture. Venus today offers no visible sign of oceans or rain. Its surface holds no ripples, no riverbeds, no carved valleys. If water ever touched its ground, the evidence has long since merged into the planet's later transformations. The heat, the pressure, and the reshaping of the land have drawn a soft curtain over whatever came before. But even worlds can keep faint echoes of what once was. A trace in the atmosphere here, a pattern of minerals there, a balance of gases that suggests different conditions long ago. These hints are delicate, like distant memories drifting to the surface, and they allow space for imagination, not wild, but measured. They let us picture Venus as a world that may have once felt less settled in its warmth, a world that might have carried liquid on its surface before that liquid slipped away. If water did exist there, one can imagine the moment, an unimaginably slow one, when the balance began to shift. The sun's warmth increasing just enough, the atmosphere thickening just enough, the surface drying in increments too small to notice at the time. As water evaporated, the air would have changed. As the air changed, the water would have evaporated faster. It would have been a gradual unwinding, not a dramatic disappearance. A long transition rather than a single event. This idea carries with it a gentle analogy to many things in nature. How habitats shift, how climates evolve, how even living beings grow into new forms without realizing they have changed until much later. Venus may have undergone a similar transformation, moving step by step from a place with some measure of water to a place where water could no longer persist. The planet did not resist. It simply continued becoming what it is. And now, millions of years later, Venus rests in its current state. Warm, cloud-wrapped, steady. Yet it is not impossible to think that beneath all of this, the planet holds faint geological and atmospheric memories of what it once might have been. Not in the form of preserved oceans or fossilized storms, but in subtler ways that scientists continue to search for and interpret. There is something quietly moving in acknowledging this. Venus, often portrayed as Earth's harsh counterpart, may once have shared a small portion of the gentler conditions that shaped our own world. It may have known moisture. It may have had skies that behaved differently, landscapes that felt less sealed. Perhaps it carried a version of calm that looked unlike the calm it holds now. Today, Venus reveals none of that openly. It has settled fully into its current identity, one defined by warmth, stillness, and an atmosphere that keeps its surface sealed. But knowing it might once have been different gives the planet a sense of depth, the way a person's distant past adds layers to their present character. It reminds us that even worlds undergo transformations so complete that their histories become whispers rather than stories. And so Venus remains a planet that may once have held water, a world that adapted quietly to changes over vast stretches of time, and a reminder that the universe is filled with places that carry pasts no longer visible, but never fully lost. When humanity first turned its attention toward Venus, not the gentle evening star, but the world hidden beneath the bright shimmer, it did so with a kind of cautious curiosity. We knew the surface must be difficult, but we did not yet understand how difficult. And so, in the spirit of discovery, we sent machines. Small ones at first, simple and sturdy, designed with the hope that they might touch the ground, whisper back a few observations, and remain functional for longer than anyone dared promise. What followed became a quiet testament to persistence. Venus is not a kind host, and the machines that reached its surface found themselves in an environment that welcomed them with the gentle firmness of a world entirely uninterested in visitors. Yet those early explorers, crafted in workshops on Earth, wrapped in metal skins, and given just enough instruments to ask a few questions, continued to make the journey. The descent through the Venusian atmosphere was a kind of challenge in itself. The clouds, dense and layered, pressed against the falling probes like warm, heavy blankets. Communications struggled to push through. Instruments flickered with the strain. A visitor passing through such an atmosphere would feel as though the planet was gently reminding them that the surface below was not meant to be reached casually. Still, the machines persisted, drifting downward, adjusting their positions with small bursts of control, doing their best to remain composed. When the first craft finally touched down on the surface, it did so with the quiet dignity of a messenger who has traveled far and intends to deliver its message regardless of the conditions. For a brief moment, a moment short enough to measure in minutes, the machine observed its surroundings. The rocks it saw had never been photographed before. The light that filtered through its lenses had traveled through clouds thicker than any earthly fog. Every piece of data it transmitted was a whisper from a place long hidden. Then the heat arrived. Not suddenly, but with a steady insistence. The temperature, unwavering and immense, began to seep through the spacecraft's shielding. Electronics that had been designed to withstand far more than typical environments encountered their limits. Circuits warmed, metal softened. The pressure, impossibly heavy compared to Earth's, pushed into every crevice. Before long, the machine, which had traveled so far and prepared so thoroughly, began to falter. It is hard not to feel a kind of affectionate respect for these probes, which lasted mere minutes in a place that offered challenges far beyond their design. Some survived for an hour. A few managed a little longer. But none remained for very long, and none were expected to. They were explorers operating at the edge of possibility, sent not with the expectation of endurance, but with the hope of a single, brief glance. And what they returned, even in their short lives, was remarkable. They captured images of the surface, rocks scattered beneath a soft, filtered glow, landscapes that seemed to stretch out into a world without a clear horizon, textures carved by processes unknown to us at the time. They recorded the pressure of the air, felt the warmth of the ground, and conveyed the eerie stillness of a planet that had locked itself into timeless conditions. Each transmission becomes more meaningful when you imagine the machine that sent it. A metal shell beginning to soften, its sensors straining, its body warming far beyond acceptable limits. Yet it continues to send its data with calm resolve, like a messenger determined to speak its final lines clearly. There is something subtly humorous in the thought. These sturdy explorers, built with confident precision, arriving on Venus only to discover that the environment had absolutely no intention of letting them stay. And still they tried. Their brief successes a testament to their design and to humanity's determination. One can imagine, with a soft smile, the machines touching down with a sense of quiet pride, taking their first measurements, and then realizing almost immediately that they are not built for long-term residency. But they do not panic. Machines rarely do. They simply continue operating until their components can no longer bear the heat, leaving the surface as quietly as they arrived. The photographs they captured, though grainy and colored by the unusual light, offer a glimpse into a world few expected to see directly. Each image feels like an artifact, something retrieved from a place where the rules of survival are dramatically different. The fact that these machines endured long enough to collect such glimpses is a small triumph, made all the more meaningful by the knowledge that none of them were designed to last. As newer probes attempted the journey, they carried improved shielding, better instruments, sturdier casings. They descended into the atmosphere with the hard-earned knowledge of those that came before. And though they lasted longer, some achieving minutes that stretched impressively into hours, the planet remained unfazed. Venus continued to accept these visitors politely but firmly, offering them only temporary stays. Yet each mission expanded our understanding. Each short-lived landing provided new insights into the surface, the air, the light, the pressure, the ground beneath the clouds. Even the failures, if they can be called that, offered valuable lessons. A broken component, a melted wire, a collapsed structure. Each one revealed something about Venus that could not be learned from afar. In this way, the machines that visited Venus leave behind a legacy of endurance, resilience, and quiet accomplishment. They remind us that exploration does not always mean conquering or settling. Sometimes it means stepping briefly into an unfamiliar place, gathering what can be gathered, and leaving before the environment gently insists that the visit is over. Their stories are not dramatic epics with triumphant returns. They are brief, humble chapters in the much larger narrative of exploration. They show that even in the harshest places, a moment of understanding can be achieved. A photograph can be taken. A measurement can be sent. A discovery can be made. And then, as always, the planet continues on, unmoved, unchanged, and perhaps only vaguely aware that for a few fleeting minutes, it received a visitor who did its best. From a distance, Venus looks peaceful, a softly glowing sphere, pale and luminous, drifting through space with the quiet self-possession of something that has settled fully into its identity. It reflects sunlight with such steadiness that it becomes one of the brightest objects in our sky, a beacon that seems almost gentle. And yet, beneath that calm exterior lies a world so profoundly different from Earth that the contrast feels almost personal, as though Venus is holding up a mirror to show us what a planet can become when its internal story unfolds along a separate path. It does this without commentary, of course. Venus offers no lessons, no moral suggestions, no whispered guidance. It simply exists nearby, close enough to be familiar, but distant enough to remain mysterious. And in that existence, it becomes an inadvertent comparison point, a neighboring world that shares our sun, our general size, and some of our basic materials, but arrived at a result that bears little resemblance to our own. Looking at Venus is like seeing a portrait of a relative whose life took an entirely different direction from your own, for reasons that are both clear and quietly profound. This proximity makes Venus a natural object for reflection. Earth has oceans, breezes, shifting seasons, and a surface shaped continuously by water and life. Venus, by contrast, feels closed, sealed into itself, wrapped in clouds that reveal nothing. Yet when we consider the two worlds side by side, there is an undeniable symmetry. Two planets, similar in scale, formed from the same primordial dust, orbiting the same star. The symmetry is softened, though, by the divergence. A divergence so complete, it encourages contemplation more than comparison. Looking at Venus allows us to imagine how differently planetary histories might unfold under small variations of initial conditions. A little more sunlight, a slightly different atmospheric composition, a subtly altered pace of geological change. These details accumulate over immense spans of time, and eventually, the paths of two worlds that began as neighbors diverge so widely that each becomes almost incomprehensible to the other. Earth, abundant with familiar textures, water, soil, air that shifts from warm to cool, feels alive in a way that encourages a sense of comfort. Venus feels still, dense, and settled. It does not change its expression. It holds its atmosphere so closely that no star is visible from the surface. No horizon stands clearly defined. In comparing the two, we find no accusations, no judgments, only difference. Yet that difference feels instructive in the quiet, observational sense of the word. Not a warning, but a reminder that planets are shaped by their conditions, slowly and unquestioningly, and that their outcomes need not resemble one another. What makes Venus an uncomfortable mirror is not that it foretells anything for Earth, but that it reveals how varied the fates of similar worlds can be. It shows that planetary environments do not adhere to a single pattern. Each follows its own trajectory based on factors too vast and gradual for any conscious mind to track. Earth became a world where water cooled the surface and life took root. Venus became a world where heat settled in and refused to leave. Neither choice was deliberate. Neither was avoidable. They were simply the results of planetary evolution, long sequences of changes that accumulated quietly until they became permanent. There is something humbling in that realization. It suggests that Earth's gentler conditions are not a guarantee, nor an expectation, but a result of a particular set of circumstances that happened to align. Venus stands beside us, a sibling world reshaped into something that feels alien despite its proximity. And though the two planets cannot communicate, the contrast between them encourages an awareness of how delicate and contingent planetary environments can be. Yet this reflection does not need to become urgent or cautionary. It can remain instead contemplative, a gentle acknowledgement of diversity within our own solar system. Venus sits nearby, silent and unchanging, its thick clouds concealing the surface but not the truth that planets need not resemble their neighbors. It is a world that evolved according to its own internal logic, attaining a stability that may seem inhospitable to us, but is, in its own geological way, quite consistent. For scientists, Venus offers a reference point, a world whose conditions help refine our understanding of atmospheres, climates, and planetary development. But for the rest of us, it provides a different kind of reflection. It shows that beauty and harshness can coexist in the same object, that a bright light in the sky can hide a world far different from what its appearance suggests, and that two planets, born from the same cosmic cradle, can drift into identities so distinct that the resemblance is visible only from the outside. There is a quiet comfort in knowing that Venus does not demand interpretation. It does not insist on being a message or a metaphor. It simply orbits, reflecting sunlight with untroubled consistency, offering itself as a reminder that nature's variety extends far beyond our expectations. The universe is filled with worlds, each shaped by its own unfolding, each carrying a history that may be impossible to infer from its appearance alone. In this way, Venus becomes a mirror not of what Earth might become, but of what Earth might have been under different circumstances. A nearby companion whose differences highlight our own world's peculiarities. A planet that does not lecture, but invites reflection through its quiet, enduring presence. It is an uncomfortable mirror only in the sense that it challenges our assumptions, and a comforting one because it reminds us that the universe contains many paths, all unfolding without haste, without commentary, and without the need for explanation. Venus does not explain itself. It simply continues to exist, a brilliant point of light in the sky, calm and inscrutable, reflecting sunlight and possibility in equal measure. If you step outside in the quiet hours around dusk or dawn, those moments when the world holds its breath between light and shadow, you may notice a familiar brilliance lingering near the horizon. It is not a dramatic glow, nor a flare that demands attention. It is a steady shimmer, gentle and certain, the kind of presence that settles naturally into the corner of one's vision. That is Venus, still tracing its path through the sky, still appearing at the edges of the day exactly as it has for as long as anyone has lifted their gaze. With everything we have learned about the planet, its slow rotation, its patient heat, its cloud-wrapped interior, it is almost comforting to realize that none of this knowledge has altered its place in the sky. Venus shines no brighter or dimmer for our understanding. It continues its soft routines without hesitation, drifting through twilight with a composure that seems entirely its own. In the end, our curiosity changes only us. The planet remains, as always, quietly luminous. If you watch Venus long enough, you may feel its steadiness settle into you. The way it rises or sets does not rush or falter. The light it offers is calm, not eager. It appears when the world is dim and retreating into rest, when sounds soften and the last colors of the day slide gently into place. Venus chooses its appearances with the kind of timing that feels deliberate, though of course it is nothing more than celestial mechanics. Still, the effect is unmistakable. A presence that arrives right when the mind is most open to quiet. There is something almost tender in how Venus occupies these hours. It does not follow the sun across the bright sky or accompany the moon through the deep night. It stays near the edges, preferring the soft boundaries where day and night exchange their subtle cues. These transitional hours have always carried a sense of stillness, and Venus slips into them like a companion who understands not to disturb. Its light is soft enough not to intrude, but steady enough to reassure. You do not need to seek it. It finds its own gentle place. As you look at it, you may remember the details, its cloud-wrapped surface, its backward-turning sky, its warm stillness, or you may not. It makes no difference. Venus offers no sign that it cares whether it is studied or ignored. It simply is, a quiet reminder that understanding is not a requirement for appreciation. The planet's light reaches you with the same grace whether or not you ponder its nature. Venus's brilliance is generous in that way. If you imagine the planet itself, far beyond that point of light, it exists in perfect indifference to being observed. It turns slowly, moves steadily along its orbit, and holds its heat with unbroken calm. The clouds swirl above its surface with ceaseless motion, concealed from our view. The wind continues its restless journey high above the still ground, and the rocks lie in their ancient positions, unchanged by the centuries. Whether seen or unseen, Venus persists with steady dignity. This persistence allows the mind to rest. In a universe full of stars that flicker and worlds that change, Venus behaves like a familiar touchstone, a point of constancy just close enough to feel personal. It doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't offer spectacle. It simply drifts through twilight, bright enough to be noticed, but quiet enough to overlook if one chooses. That balance gives it a role few other celestial objects hold. A presence that can be found whenever needed, without demanding anything in return. When twilight deepens and the colors fade, Venus may linger a little longer before finally slipping below the horizon. Its departure is gradual, softened by the thickening shadows. One moment it is there, a gleaming accent to the sky's fading palette. The next, it has sunk below sight, leaving only the afterglow of a world settling into night. There is no ceremony in its exit, no closing gesture, just the simple fact of a journey continuing out of view. And in the morning, when the sky grows pale with early light, Venus may return. It will appear again, waiting patiently at the edge of dawn, as though it stepped out only briefly and is ready to resume its quiet watch. Its rhythm is its own, unbothered by passing days or shifting centuries. You could leave for a lifetime and come back, and still it would be there, glowing gently in the same twilight spaces, unchanged by everything that changed in between. Over time, this constancy becomes something more than cosmic mechanics. It becomes an invitation. Not to learn more, not to explore further, but simply to pause. To sit for a moment with the world as it is, calm and unhurried. Venus reminds us that not all beauty needs explanation, and not all mysteries require pursuit. Some things can remain as they appear, quiet, steadfast, glowing softly in the dimming sky. As you let your gaze drift away, Venus remains where it has always been, moving in its slow, deliberate arc, framed by the gentlest hours of the day. It recedes into the distance not because it is leaving, but because the earth is turning, carrying you into night or into morning. Venus simply continues, unchanged and unchanging, a soft point of light that asks nothing and offers only its calm presence. And so the chapter closes not with discovery, nor with conclusion, but with a steady, lingering glow. Venus, still there, still bright, still patient, rests in the twilight, its light settling into the quiet spaces of the sky, where nothing more needs to be learned and nothing more needs to be said.